I'd like to introduce Diana West today. Diana is the author of a new book scheduled to be released in 2013 entitled American Betrayal, The Secret Assault on Our Nation's Character. However, I met Diana in 2007 when her book Death of the Grown-Up first came out, and she was the annual speaker for the Maryland Taxpayers Association's annual meeting. Little could we have imagined then that Diana's description of how our cultural decline and the evolution and steep rise of multiculturalism and political correctness would have led the following year to the election of the first truly man-child president of the United States, Barack Obama. It probably didn't come as a surprise to Diana. And we are all witnessing the death of the grown-ups daily in Washington as we watch America fall off the fiscal cliff. West writes a weekly syndicated column that appears in 120 publications. Her work has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Times, the Weekly Standard, and the Washington Post magazine. She also blogs at dianawest.net. At our 2011 conference, we hosted Frank Gaffney of the Center for Security Policy, who had just published Sharia, The Threat to America. And by the way, it stimulated protesters that will probably be out here later today, too. Diana West was one of the co-authors of that publication, along with Andrew McCarthy and James Woolsey. More recently, Diana was featured in 2 Glenn Beck TV documentaries, The Project and Rumors of War 3. So without further delay, I'd like to introduce Diana West, who, among other things, has become an expert on military issues, and she'll tell us what she believes a conservative foreign policy strategy should look like if grown-ups were in charge.
Thank you very much. I brought a real speech on paper today. I'm not going to do panel, it's wonderful improv. I would like to make one point to add on to the notion of the Gore Al Jazeera buy, which of course is very important, and the hypocrisy certainly needs to be called out, as well as the threat that this incursion of the Muslim Brotherhood / Al Jazeera media into American homes surely presents. Fox News is part owned by a scion of another Arab Muslim dictatorship, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Prince Al-Walid bin Talal is, at last count, the second largest shareholder in News Corp, which of course is the parent company of Fox, the Wall Street Journal, New York Post, and other fine conservative publications. So there is a problem on our side of the media that is not being covered, certainly at Fox News. And it does indeed, I believe, filter the news that we get from Fox. So while you watch your favorite anchor making hay of Al Gore's purchase, think about what they're telling you and look for mentions of Muslim Brotherhood and Al Jazeera, which I have not been able to really find. And also such Al Jazeera assets as Sheikh Qaradawi, who's a senior figure in the Muslim Brotherhood, and of course the leading anchor, or one of the leading programs at Al Jazeera, and see if you see mention of Qaradawi in the Fox coverage, because I have been having trouble finding it. So that's just kind of a sidelight to keep. We need to be very vigilant, because sometimes things are not what they seem even on our side. So now onto the conservative foreign policy, which I'm going to be speaking on, which is kind of a tall order. Anne asked me to think about developing a conservative foreign policy, so I'm debuting it here. This is the first anyone's heard my conservative foreign policy. Certainly it's a work in progress, but I think it is a very important thing for us to be thinking through, and it's something that's very much needed, because I think what we can look at, the, considering the post 9/11 era, I think it's fair to say we have been following mainly a neo-conservative foreign policy. I would describe such a policy as one we've been following is based on rock-solid belief in the existence of universal values that all peoples everywhere share and indeed yearn for if they don't enjoy them already. Our neoconservative foreign policy then, which is also our war-fighting policy, has been a matter of spreading these universal values. And this has been a disaster. Think of nation building in Iraq and Afghanistan, and these are policies that are predicated on this denial of the existence of cultural difference. Certainly in the decades since 9/11, we should have learned that cultures, the West and Islam mainly, are different, and that such universalism that we've been following is a fantasy. The West enshrines the liberty of the individual, as Pamela was talking about, while Islam, like other totalitarian systems, enforces the collective will. Still, we don't permit this simple reality to be discussed, let alone reflected in any meaningful policy way. Now, the main dissent to this view of foreign policy comes from the libertarian side of the right, which is, of course, most popularly expressed by Ron Paul. And this is a policy of Come Home America. I subscribe to Coming Home America. However, what I hear from our libertarian friends most often is that the way to fill the resulting vacuum is with a foreign policy that seeks negotiation and accommodation with Islam. And such a policy, just like the policy of the neocons, fails to take into account Islamic realities that make such negotiations worse than fruitless, and such accommodations quite dangerous to our liberty. So with that said, what should a conservative foreign policy that is neither neoconservative nor libertarian look like? So in thinking about this and formulating such a conservative alternative, I'm starting with love of country. Now, this is not to suggest that any of the other competing voices or views do not begin with love of country. But in thinking this through, I think it's essential to start, getting back to basics, with the desire to live by, to continue to live by and protect the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. It's really that simple. My closest allies in the world would be those with compatible philosophical views, what cousins we still have in the Western democracies, Israel, nations fighting jihad such as India, not Pakistan, not Saudi Arabia. My conservative foreign policy would require energy independence. It would also require leaving the United Nations. There's applause for that line, because when I've mentioned this to Washington types, I get blank stares and it looks like I'm crazy, but I think this is where it starts. I believe in the UN, where an immoral charade of more than half a century has permitted rule of law democracies to vie on an equal playing field with thuggish dictatorships in a rigged wheel that elevates the dictatorships and tarnishes the democracies. Much better to have an international organization of democracies. But I believe a conservative foreign policy would not first and foremost be global in scope or application, but rather designed with the interests of the American people in mind. I've always, over this, I have found it more than disturbing listening to U.S. generals such as McChrystal discuss the Afghan people as the supreme reason for fighting for the Afghan people. We should fight for the American people. But who are they again? It's very simple. Those people blessed to be citizens in this land of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, which protects liberty. By default, and this is very important, it's so simple, but it's lost in the static. Our rivals, our opponents, our enemies become those who are hostile to or try to deprive us of those same liberties, such as freedom of speech. With these admittedly simple truths in mind, it should become easy to see how far we stray from our small r Republican values in world affairs. Under George Bush, we began negotiating with terrorists, Al-Qaeda insurgents in Iraq. At home, we began hitting at the First Amendment as our own government sought to create lexicons to discuss Islam without using the terminology of Islam, such as jihad, caliphate. words like that. We have created and sent our American forces to defend Sharia supreme constitutions in Iraq and Afghanistan. And that was just the beginning. We now go so far as to blame US troops for their own murders as infidels by their Muslim partners. I don't know how else to characterize a recent draft of a new Army handbook that cites as a cause of these so-called insider attacks, quote, ignorance of or lack of empathy for Muslims and or Afghan cultural norms as a cause. Such cultural norms, of course, include such practices as child rape, stoning, cruelty to dogs, and any number of culture clash items that you do not want your American forces to get used to or indeed bring home. And so a lot of these incidents have begun in disputes over these absolute outrages against American beliefs and sensibilities. When we got to Arab Spring, we switched sides altogether. Uncle Sam joined the jihad in Libya. It's true, we supported, again without any kind of discussion, Al-Qaeda and other jihadists across the Middle East, in Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, and increasingly Syria. We have now crashed through the traces of anything resembling an American foreign policy based in love of country. How else to explain the WikiLeaks record that shows our late ambassador to Libya, Christopher Stevens, back in 2008, trying to think through a way to work with jihadists back from killing Americans in Iraq? How else to explain the barely remarked upon shipment this month of F-16s to the Muslim Brotherhood government of Mohammed Morsi? How else to explain our Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, working hand in hand with the Islamic bloc to criminalize blasphemy, which is criticism of Islam, and promising to arrest and prosecute a video maker in retribution for the terror attacks on the US consulate in Benghazi? And why, no one has answered this, why did the Obama administration lie for 2 weeks that lawfully protected free speech in America caused the Benghazi terrorist attacks? Where is our America of the First Amendment when the President of the United States tells the UN General Assembly that, quote, the future must not belong to those who slander the Prophet of Islam? Why didn't Mitt Romney ask any of these questions? That's another story. But in thinking over some of these items in my litany, I think my heart breaks the most whenever I hear a young American in uniform tell a reporter he is fighting abroad to protect liberty at home. Is that true? If it ever was true, did it stay true? Do these sacrifices really protect liberty at home? And do our leaders ever even ask themselves such a question? There has been what we might think of as a big bang at the leadership level in which American interests have been blown to smithereens. So how do we put them together for a new century? Where does a conservative foreign policy begin? All foreign policy begins at the border, and clearly our policy at the border shows no love of country. Our borders, even more than a decade after 9/11, are still effectively open. We have plenty of National Guard units who could help, but they're patrolling roads and borders in Afghanistan and losing life and limbs to IEDs while they're at it. Meanwhile, all manner of hostile actors and dangerous materiel, not to mention illegal aliens, slip across U.S. borders. Does that make sense? Not with love of country in mind. When you look at the more bureaucratic aspect of border security, that first line of our foreign policy, we have an immigration system that legally opens our borders to tens of thousands of people every year from cultures that inculcate an aversion or even a hostility to the rights and responsibilities inherent to the American people, we citizens guided by the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. For example, Pew polling last year told us that Hispanics, who of course constitute the main block of these immigrants, illegal and legal and perhaps soon to be amnestied, that this polling tells us that 75% of Hispanics want bigger government and more services versus 41% of Americans overall. So this has deep ramifications at the voting booth, looking ahead, looking at the last election. The teachings of Islamic law, meanwhile, which Muslims hold supreme above all other law, clash directly with Article 6 of the Constitution, which holds that the Constitution shall be the supreme law of the land. And that's without mentioning the many laws and beliefs of Islam that are directly at odds with our laws and liberties. Given that we are a democratic country and that demographics become democratic destiny, do these immigration policies make sense? Again, not with love of country in mind. But there's another problem. One of the strangest phenomena of the past presidential campaign, to me, was the extent to which foreign policy of any kind went unaddressed, even though we were just ending one disastrous war in Iraq and we're in the midst of another such disastrous war in Afghanistan. I wonder how many people in the room remember that almost exactly a year ago, on December 31st, 2011, Iraq's Nouri al-Maliki declared a national holiday to celebrate the withdrawal of US forces from Iraq. He wasn't saying thank you. The Prime Minister, as the AP reported, was trying to credit Iraqis with the overthrow of Saddam Hussein and made no mention of the role played by US forces. It was all just a dream, just $1 trillion mirage. And who doesn't believe our efforts in Afghanistan will one day be just as much a gigantic non-event? I noted at that time that this Iraqi silence suited the American political classes just fine. Our withdrawal after more than 8 years of fighting prompted no questions such as, what was all that about? Or what went wrong in Iraq? Or did something go wrong in Iraq? And is it a good idea to replicate that strategy in Afghanistan, which is exactly what was done? Any discussion in Republican primaries was very, very limited for the most part, and it was certainly over by the time we turned to the general campaign. There was no debate on foreign policy, period. And the final debate between President Obama and Mitt Romney was mainly a series of points at which Mitt Romney agreed with President Obama. And maybe this isn't surprising, given that there's a continuity between the Republican and Democratic prosecutions of these wars. Indeed, there's a continuum, I would say, between 9/11 and the Arab Spring, which of course former President Bush has openly applauded. But we need to break this kind of silence if we are ever to get to a decent foreign policy, let alone a conservative one. And I think to do so, we really need to understand some of the immediate obstacles. One, our military culture is separate from the rest of our culture. We have a bifurcated society. Our military has become, in effect, a foreign legion, and a self-perpetuating culture, because you very often see parents military parents having children who join the service. We certainly, I would say we need a draft when we fight a war, and I would say we certainly immediately need more congressional oversight. Obama was able to run roughshod over Congress, particularly in Libya, where we did see some agitation on the Hill. But Congress does have the power of the purse and can defund a president running amok, and they should be encouraged to do so. Now, our foreign policy since Roosevelt, since FDR, has been increasingly conducted by presidential fiat and in secrecy, and this has to change to bring us to a good conservative foreign policy. But another thing that has to change to get us there is our mindset on foreign policy has to change. I feel that we've become very abject. We have deferred our rights as citizens on foreign policy. I mean, look at the reaction to WikiLeaks, which for the most part, for the vast majority of WikiLeaks, were unclassified documents or confidential, which is the lowest form of classification. There was a slice of secret, small. I have been through as many as I can. I have not seen terrible damage from them. I have seen evidence of much corruption and lies on the part of our public officials. But the general feeling about seeing this kind of policy making was more, we shouldn't look at it. We shouldn't know. It should be secret. They should be able to do this in secret. I don't believe that is the way a republic functions, and that needs to change. But chiefly, I think the reason for silence on foreign policy gets to the subject of the morning, which I think we're very uncomfortable publicly, or probably privately, discussing Islam. And since so much foreign policy in this era has to deal with Islam, we have to get through that. Because while we dither in our embarrassed silence, the world is changing and our liberties are shrinking. So I surely hope before it's too late, we take into account the crucial idea that the war that's fallen to our generation is not the war we've been fighting. It's not the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, or now looking to Syria or Somalia, or who knows where else in Africa and the rest. It certainly is not a war for hearts and minds in the Islamic world, as our presidents and generals have been telling us since 9/11. It is just not our mission or our place to bring Western-style liberty to the world of Islam. But it is up to us to save liberty at home, for love of country, our country. The war we must gear up to fight to save our country and protect the Constitution and the Bill of Rights is the war against Sharia, here, in America and the wider West. So, yes, I reject a neoconservative foreign policy that takes us into interventions abroad, and agree with libertarians that it is time to come home, to leave Afghanistan as soon as and as completely as possible, blowing up what we can't take with us, as a former Green Beret friend of mine said. But, more importantly, armed with the knowledge that the most important fight is still ahead. Liberty is imperiled right here in our backyard. Yes. Thank you.
Again, only questions, no speeches. Make them as brief as possible so that we keep the line under control. Thank you.
I don't know if it's on. Diane,
It should be on.
I just wanted to say, with your introduction,
Diane, I wanted to say that I apologize for that. With the introduction, I was afraid you were going to offer a neocon foreign policy. So at this point, having listened to you, I want to applaud you.
Why?
Well, there was something in the introduction.
Oh, Weekly Standard.
The Weekly Standard, exactly.
Yes.
And Woolsey also. So I apologize, but I applaud your development. My question was, the applause line about the United Nations. I've certainly considered that. I think it may be a good idea, but I wanted to ask you in your development about the distinction between the General Assembly and the Security Council, and the functions we potentially might lose and the value that may be lost about our seat in the Security Council. So that's my question.
Well, I think if America didn't participate in the United Nations, the Security Council probably wouldn't mean very much. So I wouldn't regret that. I certainly don't think it's a good exchange. I think that it has taken us much closer on so many levels, and I'm not a scholar at the UN, although I'm sure I should be, in terms of moving toward global governance, toward moving away from national interests, toward moving toward these concepts called responsibility to protect, which is actually the sort of egghead concept under which we were enforcing the no-fly zone and war in Libya with NATO partners. So I don't see any, if you're measuring pros and cons, I see many, many more pros in terms of removing ourselves from the UN.
fair enough. Thank you.
Well, the direction of the government doesn't seem to be able to be changed very easily. Obamacare, we had 1 million people in D.C. a couple of years ago. So what's your recommendations to make sure that the government does indeed go the direction that the vast majority of the American people want?
Voter turnout? It's a very serious point, actually, although it can sound silly. When you look at the exit polling, which I've been through as best I can, you do see that there were many categories, surprising categories, that Mitt Romney actually won, that drew me to think, if only there was more turnout in our constituencies. For example, married people. Married people elected Mitt Romney across all categories. White women voted for Mitt Romney. This was one I did not know. In fact, there was certainly a racial characteristic to exit polling. You did see Romney winning among white college students, any number of white categories, income levels 50,000 and above, he also won. So when you're looking at this, it made me realize you have to go to your constituencies, you have to frighten them into voting, because I think fear is a very important goad. If you're losing your country, they need to know it. And in terms of the racial disparity, I think that the way to accommodate this or to develop this is actually an educational one, because I just think that the affinity for constitutional rule, constitutional law, must be taught at every level, and I think that that is a way to enlarge the knowledge base that will lead people to make a small government choice. But in the meantime, the constituencies that vote for smaller government, for more constitutional values, need to be harnessed the way President Obama was able to harness his constituencies. He actually got more turnout in his groups, black women, for example, Hispanics, than he did last time when there was all the fervor. And we didn't sense the fervor this time. They were there getting voter turnout. And we were not able to do that in our groups. And I think that it does become a struggle in the end for that. So that would be my personal political advice.
Diane, recognizing that this is in draft form, is there some place that you could, I think you have some tremendous ideas in here. Is there some place that you could put it on the web?
I have a website, I'll put it there.
Great, thank you. I think we can all benefit by reading it.
Wonderful, yes, that's dianawest.net, and I will go home and put it there today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. West. Can you address the issue that American foreign policy seems to support the Islamic regime?
Oh, yes, about Uncle Sam joining the jihad.
That kill Christians, cause Christians to leave, burn their churches, and rape their women.
Well, it's an immoral, ugly, and self-defeating policy, and it is certainly not well covered in our media. And I would add, I don't think I've seen many reports on Christian depredations on Fox News. Have you? No. Funny. You know, again, looking at Fox, it's what we go to, right? And yet, I've been watching this for a long time and chronicling it when I can, and noticing we're not seeing that. Why are we doing this? We're doing this because our elites want to do this. We're doing this because the globalists, the UN, our president, but also our former president, President Bush, presided over the eradication almost of the Christian population of Iraq while we were there, while our troops were there. So this is a problem I can't exactly explain. It's very perplexing, it's very troubling. It's something, again, to bring up with your local representatives who go to Washington to ask questions, and tell them, please ask questions, please don't be afraid. They have so much power, and they don't use it. I don't know why they don't work sometimes. You know, all they have to do are ask questions. But, you know, I don't have a good answer, so I could ramble on it, but it's definitely a question we should all be asking.
Thank you for your thoughtful commentary on foreign policy and critiquing both the neocon and the Ron Paul positions. But Islam is one of the major challenges in our foreign policy, but what are your thoughts on some of the others, like China and possibly resurgent Russia?
Yes, well, they are certainly huge problems and challenges ahead. On China, if I were president, I would hire Donald Trump to deal with China. Personally, that would be my go-to man. I stay very involved in watching the cultural shift that Islam is bringing. China is not bringing the same kind of cultural shift, except maybe perhaps in terms of our economic life, certainly. As for Russia, Russia remains, as always, a significant danger player, adversary, and so on, and certainly one that our president said he'd be much more flexible in dealing with in this term. Again, another golden opportunity our candidate forsook, in not highlighting, for example, in commercial ads. But no, vigilance and certainly, personally, I would try to lead economic boycotts of Chinese goods. Those are some random thoughts.
My question is somewhat similar to his, but I wanted to ask about when we actually have a military threat, such as Iran.
Speak into the microphone.
Okay. Well, we actually have a military threat such as Iran, which is openly making nukes, which it wants to use to attack us. Coming home and fighting Sharia don't quite cover that. And I don't know what other military threats will arise. Now, it seems to me that some of the things you said secrecy is really bad and everything should be done in the open. I recall when President Reagan was fighting communism, he had secret things all over the place. He had people in supporting dissident groups. You know, he really was focused on the overthrow of communism. And that was in secret. Now, the reason we didn't object to it is that he was on our side. And if you do something in secret, but you're on our side, fine. Our real problem is that we don't feel that we have people on our side up there. You know, it's become this... the board and the rest of us.
Right, well, I don't mean to say that no government-to-government or leader-to-leader conversations or dealings should be conducted without secrecy or confidentiality and so on. But in terms of the classification of our government's workings, I forget the number, because it's one of those numbers that's too big to remember, but it's in the hundreds of millions of documents are classified, I believe, every year, if not tens of millions. The number is exponential. It's one of those astronomical figures. And that has created this secret, top secret eligible class of about 1 million people in the Washington area and related agencies who are doing things that we don't know. And I find that very alarming for the workings of a democracy. That was my main point about secrecy. In terms of, what was your other question?
Iran. Yes.
Oh, Iran. Well, Iran, yes. No, it isn't a matter of eliminating America's military reach or military projection. I have came to find the recommendations of General Valery, something he describes as the lily pad strategy, which is a strategy whereby you rely on strike forces and friendly countries from which to launch military action as needed to destroy enemies who are posing an imminent threat to you or your interests or allies. And this would be the way I would certainly ask, if I were in charge, I would ask my military experts to move on such a plan, because obviously coming home is not a way to make threats go away. My focus on focusing on coming out of the Islamic world, where we are trying to create friends and friends of the American system, friends of the Western system, is to recognize that is not going to happen in the Islamic world, and that meanwhile, while we are doing all this in the Islamic world, nation building, road building, dam building, training, education, money, 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 Europe, which is an important part of America's freedom too, and America, are being demographically and culturally infiltrated by a very hostile force, the force of Sharia, the force of Islamization. These are issues also not covered on Fox that are going on. If any of you have made trips to Europe in the past several years, you will see it everywhere. This is the sphere of freedom, I think, that needs to be emphasized as where we actually try to impose, if that's the right word, or restore liberty, not worrying about putting liberty into the Islamic world. Now, as far as Iran goes, serious threat, particularly to our key strategic ally and cultural ally, Israel. We need to support Israel and whatever allies we can draw in. Absolutely. I think it is immoral to leave the job to Israel, a country with very small strategic depth, I think is the term, because of course it's a very small country, to go at this alone, which certainly has been, if it's a plan, it's certainly been the plan since the Bush years. And I think that that is very wrong. We made a deal in Iraq whereby I believe the airspace is not even ours to open to friends, or ask the Iraqis who are not friends to open to friends. So it becomes very difficult. These were all along in our various blunders through this past decade. But I think Iran is a tremendous threat, as is Pakistan. Iran is not the only country that is nuclear and that can end up in the hands of the jihadist targeting Ayatollah. So these are both terrible situations, and you know, I definitely think it's not a matter of curbing American military might to a point of no use. I don't think that that makes sense, and I would not advocate that, but I think in terms of our main stretch, it's almost like we've been, it's really quite brilliant if it is a strategy of the jihadists. We have been mired in one place while the rest of the world has been utterly larded and laced with threats.
5 minutes.
Hi, Diane.
Hi, Ken.
Thank you for this very thoughtful presentation, and I think this is an excellent discussion for us to be having as conservatives. And I like the criteria that you have of does a foreign intervention restore or enhance our liberties here at home? And I think that is a very good definition, and I think there have certainly been excesses of the neocon approach to foreign policy over the past 10 years. This said, I think you can make a very strong case for the military intervention in both Iraq and Afghanistan at the beginning. Not the 10 years war, but at the beginning. I wrote a book called Shadow Warriors, the story of traitors and the Party of Surrender, and you'll notice in that book that the strategy of the Iraq War was not to occupy, but was to go in, get rid of Saddam Hussein, put the Iraqis in charge and get out, which is why Donald Rumsfeld said in April of 2003 that he wasn't worried about chaos, he wasn't worried about freedom being messy, the Iraqis were going to control it. And that was sabotaged and undermined by the State Department and the CIA. So I don't think it was an excess of neocon foreign policy. I think Bush's policy of handing it over and getting out was undermined, which is a very different view.
What would you say that nation building as a strategy to add on to the invasions is where we went wrong?
Yeah, nation building was not part of the original strategy. It was not part of the strategy. It was added on by the State Department and the CIA, and it was a disaster. And it has led to all of the things that you have mentioned. Same thing in Afghanistan. The reason we did not have all those troops in Afghanistan and needed a surge a year and a half ago was because we were not there to occupy. We were there to bolster the Afghan forces. It wasn't working very well, and it was time to terminate the mission. Now, what I did want to ask you about was Iran, again, as the woman before me did. We face a clear and present danger from Iran. I've been working since my political campaign with the pro-freedom movement in Iran. I've gone back to the Foundation for Democracy in Iran, which is Iran.org. And I believe, as I said during the campaign, that it is in our national interest, it is in our national interest as Americans to help the people of Iran get rid of their regime, because that regime poses a clear and present danger to us through its nuclear weapons, through its support for terrorism, and to its threats to Israel, its threats to Jews worldwide, and its threats to our society directly. Now, that doesn't mean boots on the ground. It does not mean a war. It does not mean a neocon intervention or a spreading of our ideals. It means finding people on the ground that want to get rid of that aggressive and expansionist regime and helping them every way that we can from this country, whether as a private venture or as the United States government. I am certain that the Obama administration is not going to do that. Would you recommend that a future Republican president do that?
To assist Iranian
pro-freedom
opposition. If pro-freedom, if a significant pro-freedom Iranian opposition emerged, yes, I would.
June 2009, 3 million people on the streets crying out, Obama, are you with us or are you with them? And Obama said, I'm with them. In other words, I'm with the regime. We had a clear opportunity to topple the regime in June of 2009 with our voices and a little bit with our pocketbooks, not with the 82nd Airborne.
Right. Well, I have to defer to you, Ken, on some of this, but I remember at the time noting that the opposition leader, at least at that time, was Mousavi. His background, and certainly his wife's background, led me to believe that there was not a whole lot of difference given their allegiance, as I recall, to the Ayatollah Khomeini in the early days. So I personally didn't climb on that bandwagon of, at that time, of an Iranian opposition, because the Mousavi alternative did not entice me. In fact, I believe, if it's coming back to me, he also had some choice things to say about Israel as well.
Absolutely.
So I think, in my sense, I'm not sure that would lead to where we want to go, but I certainly want to get there.
We could have a long discussion about this, but what happened specifically in the detail was Mousavi was overtaken by the pro-freedom movement on the ground, and he became irrelevant.
Can you make your question 30 seconds, and we need to wrap up in 2 minutes.
Diana, thank you so much for all your work. I am a huge fan. It's just wonderful to read your cogent articles and hear you. Not enough on television, on interviews and panels. Please get out there. Question, do you see any current elected officials now in the Congress that represent this conservative foreign policy that you're describing, that may be not the neocon and not the extreme libertarian view? And I'm kind of curious what you think about Ron Paul's son Rand Paul and how he's developing in this view.
I think he's developing well. Thank you very much for your kind comments. I think that just to mention a couple of Congress members who do deserve our thanks, at least in trying and learning and actually educating themselves in these terms. Representative Michelle Bachmann, two very stalwart members who have done much as they can, and without any support, except from a few of their colleagues, whose name I would have to go back to my notes on, who were together with Michelle Bachmann, for example, last summer. Yes, Trent Franks, right. When Michelle Bachmann and 4 of her colleagues wrote a letter to 5 inspectors general at 5 different government agencies, Defense, State, and a few others, Homeland Security, Pentagon, White House Department of National Intelligence, asking simply to investigate whether Muslim Brotherhood penetration could have been affecting some very strange policy developments in our conduct, our foreign policy conduct, and these were enumerated in 5 different letters and later elaborated on. And if you remember that, because it was covered in certain ways very hard in terms of crucifying Michelle Bachmann as a Joseph McCarthy figure, which is an aversion of reality, because the more we find out about Joseph McCarthy, the more we find out he deserves our gratitude. Another story they tried to take away from our history, another piece of our history that's been taken from us. But to get back to what you're saying, these 5 congressmen had the courage to actually stand up and ask. And at this point, even though that seems like a baby step, it was a big deal. And fortunately, they were reelected, and hope that they can go forward with this. But those would be 2 names, certainly, in Trent Franks. There's several others who are looking. I certainly hope there's more investigations on Benghazi. I haven't had a Benghazi question that focused on much of my fall. There's much more to uncover there, including, I would just throw it out there, whether General Petraeus committed a felony by apparently lying to congressional committees twice. No comment on that in the media, follow-up, just put it out there.
I'm so sorry, we're going to have to stop the question. Rick, can you really fast?
Okay, it'll be 10 seconds. In about 20 years, France and England will be majority Muslim countries, and they're both nuclear powers today. Just wondering what you think that bodes for France.
Bad, very bad. I could give you a longer answer outside, but I know we have to wrap up. No, the Islamization of Europe is the great uncovered story of our time, and I suppose the harbinger of what can happen to us if we don't get vigilant.